Good morning, Psych students. Welcome back. Hope you had a good weekend. Hope it was restful and everybody's staying safe and healthy. Today, I just want to follow up with the reenactment video that hopefully you watched on Friday on Stanley Milgram's obedience experiment, one of the more controversial experiments in psych history. Basically, it helped change the ethical rules at least a little bit, because one of the big issues with the experiment was he forgot to debrief anybody. And as you guys saw on Friday, people did the whole idea of debriefing is after the experiment, you have to tell people, okay, this is what the experiment was about, share the results with them. And one of those things, offer counseling. And some of the people definitely, as you saw on Friday, were very traumatized by their experiences with the experiment. Okay, because basically, what do you learn about yourself? If you're the type of person who goes with the experiment and follows through, you'll learn that just because somebody told you to, you're willing to electrocute another person in another room. Hey, just because somebody kept saying over and over and over again, hey, you have to continue, you have to continue. So Milgram did not expect the results of this experiment to turn out that way. He definitely, when he's conducting the experiment at Yale in the 1960s, didn't think things would turn out the way it did. But as you saw on the video on Friday, people even now in the 2000s were willing to keep going and going and going up to 150 volts. It's important they made that distinction. So I'll just debrief you guys and talk a little bit. And the whole idea of the experiment is you go in and you pick a random sheet of paper out of a hat. It says you're the teacher, because you're not going to be the learner. The learner is a confederate, kind of like you saw in the Ash experiment last week, somebody who was in on the experiment. So pick teacher, then you start at, you say, okay, I'm on this side of the wall, you're on that side of the wall. Hey, start asking them word pair questions. Every time they get one wrong, you zap them. Okay, you give them a mild electric shock, and it increases as you go, all the way up to 350, 400 volts. In the original Milgram experiment, the crazy thing was, and the person's not actually getting electrocuted. They make noises like they are. There's a tape recording of them saying, please stop. My heart's bothering me. So you hear those recordings, and then you have to think to yourself, well, do I keep doing this? Do I keep administering the electric shocks? Or do I stop and say, okay, I'm done. I'm not going to do this anymore. In the original Milgram study, it was kind of horrifying because people got so far along that the tape recording that wasn't responding anymore. So basically, you deliver a shock of 300 volts, 325. You ask the question, there's no response. You shock them again, no response. Basically, like the person's passed out or dead at that point. That's what you're meant to think. Of course, tape recording, you're not actually administering the electrical shock. So you learn, a lot of people learn in the Milgram experiment that they were sadists, that they were basically, capable of killing someone just because somebody told them to. So the reenactment. Let's talk. The basic, you should get out your notes today. Okay, we're on the obedience Milgram experiment. There's, a few different factors. So Milgram was horrified after this. He said he could go in any mid-sized town in the United States and basically recreate the Holocaust because he was horrified at what people were willing to do. So looking at different factors, why people were willing to obey. Okay, so the first thing, legitimacy of authority. So point number one, legitimacy of authority. What that means, or what Milgram says it means in this study, is you're at a university, whether it's Yale in the 1960s or I think it was one of the University of California schools in the 2000s. Okay, so you're not a professor, you're not a psychologist. Okay, and you go in there, and here's this person in a lab coat, looking very official, telling you have to continue with the experiment. A lot of they talked about that when in the experiment, how when they'd give them a zap and they'd hear a scream, they'd turn and they'd look, then they'd look at the researcher. Okay, the person conducting the experiment, who would then say, you have to continue. Although the shocks are painful, they're not fatal. You have to continue. The experiment must go on, and things like that. That created that legitimacy of authority. Somebody in a lab coat tells you what to do. Well, in a lab coat, it must be a doctor. It must be a scientist. They look pretty smart and official. I guess I better keep doing what they want me to do. Which, sounds silly on the surface of it. You'd like to think to yourself, just because somebody's in a lab coat doesn't mean I'm going to agree to electrocute somebody else. But they think that played a role. The legitimacy of the authority. Having somebody, who seems smarter than you, seems more official than you, played a role. Number 2, the closeness of authority. Closeness of authority. One thing Milgram did was he altered the experiment a couple times to see what the results was. In the original experiment, the person's in the room with you, standing, a few feet away from you over your shoulder. You look back, they tell you have to continue. One variation they did was putting the authority figure in another room and having them say the orders. You have to continue over a loudspeaker, over the public address system, kind of like we have our announcements over. They found that in the original experiment, we're looking at almost 70% of the people willing to shock somebody to death. Willing to go all the way to the point of no return. When he did that, it dropped. People were less willing when the authority figure wasn't there. They were much less willing to continue shocking the person. Number 3, the foot in the door technique. Number 3 is the foot in the door technique. We'll talk about this a little later on in the week. The idea of the foot in the door technique is once you say yes, once you agree to a small request, you're more likely to continue agreeing to larger requests. So the idea was that once people started shocking and decided to themselves, okay, 75 volts, 80 volts, 90 volts, okay, this is all right, they're more likely to keep going down the line, more likely to continue administering the shocks. Small request followed by a large request. And once you start agreeing, they mentioned that the people who were less likely to go on in the video were likely people who resisted early. I think there was one guy who, after one shock and one person, the other guy saying ow, was like, okay, I'm done. Not doing this anymore. So that would be an example of foot in the door thing. Once you stop saying yes, it's done, it's over. Once you start saying yes, you continue down the line. So one thing Milgram said, and they talked about this toward the end of the video with the people who actually resisted, they found that most of them took responsibility. Most of them identified with the victim and said things like, well, I feel like I would be a person who delivered the shock that killed him. I would have killed a guy. Other people said no. Other people said that they didn't feel responsible. It wasn't my fault, and this kind of rationalization took place. So the key difference between the people who kept shocking was saying, well, it was the researcher. The researcher told I was just following orders. I was doing what they wanted me to do. And you kind of saw that play out in a couple different real life examples. That horrifying McDonald's incident from the video on Friday, the Abu Ghraib prison, that people were just like, I was just doing what I was told to do. Or even worse, the Holocaust, people willing to do things just because they were told to. It was the authority figure's fault, not mine. The people who resisted, the people who stopped, said, well, no, I'm ultimately the one that's responsible. So I think if we're looking for any optimistic takeaway, because some of the stuff in social psychology can get pretty dark. You wonder, geez, what the heck is wrong with people? Why would they do something like this? The optimistic take is that, well, there are people out there, and perhaps you could use this yourself, who are not going to follow orders blindly, who are going to say things like, well, is this the right thing to do? Is it a wrong thing to do? And as where you make the decision because you ultimately take responsibility for your actions. That would be a positive take, maybe something that we can learn from the Milgram study. Don't just blindly obey authority. Don't just do what you're told if you know it's in a moral order. That post-conventional moral reasoning we talked about earlier in the semester. Okay, so we'll share an even more, just as controversial experiment tomorrow with Philip Zimbardo and the Stanford Prison Experiment. Till then, have a good day. See you tomorrow.